The scream wasn't real, but it felt real enough to tear Jack Mercer out of sleep. He bolted upright, chest-heaving sweat cold on his back. For a second, he didn't know where he was. The world around him was a blur of dark wood and moonlight, the smell of pine smoke and wet dog thick in the cabin. Then he heard the low, steady thump of a tail against the floorboards. Bear was there. The old German shepherd mix sat at the foot of the bed, amber eyes gleaming in the half-light. His ears twitched, reading his owner the way only a rescue dog could. When Jack didn't move, Bear stood and pressed his head against Jack's arm, grounding him in silence. Jack swallowed hard, the ghost of the scream still echoing inside his skull. It had been the same dream for 10 years, snow, the sound of rope snapping, and a boy's terrified eyes disappearing into white nothing. He rubbed his face with calloused hands. "It's fine," he muttered, voice gravelly from disuse. "We're fine." Bear gave a quiet grunt, unconvinced. Outside, the wind moaned through the tall Douglas firs that surrounded the cabin like sentinels. The moonlight carved silver lines across the floor. The clock on the wall ticked slow and heavy, reminding him that time still moved, even when he didn't. Jack swung his legs over the edge of the bed and sat there for a long moment, staring at the floorboards, worn smooth by years of pacing. He hadn't spoken to another person in months, maybe a year. The forest didn't ask questions, and he preferred it that way. He whispered, almost to himself sometimes, "The ghosts don't wait for nightfall." By mid-morning, the nightmare had faded to a dull ache behind his ribs. Jack pushed open the cabin door, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hand, and stepped into the cold Oregon air. The scent of rain lingered from last night's storm. Mist curled low along the tree line, soft as smoke. His cabin sat on the edge of Mount Hood National Forest, a place where the map gave up and the wilderness began. It was supposed to be temporary when he first came here a few months to clear his head after retirement. 10 years later, the forest still hadn't let him go. Bear padded beside him as he walked toward the old storage shed behind the cabin. The door creaked like an old bone when he pulled it open. Inside was chaos tools, ropes, camping gear, stacks of old field journals from his father's days as a park photographer. He hadn't been here in years. "Guess we're doing this today," he murmured. He started sorting through the clutter of shovels, tackle boxes, a coil of climbing rope older than him. The bear sniffed at every corner tail wagging lazily. Then the dog froze, ears pricked. He nudged a dusty crate under a broken window, whining low. "What's got you worked up?" Jack knelt, brushing away cobwebs. The crate was heavy army green with a corroded latch. He didn't remember ever seeing it before. The latch groaned when he forced it open. Inside, wrapped in a decaying canvas cloth, was a camera, a vintage Nikon F2, the kind his father used. The metal gleamed faintly under the dust. Jack's breath caught. He hadn't seen this camera since his father's funeral 15 years ago. He turned it over in his hands, testing the weight, the texture of worn leather. It still smelled faintly of pine resin and old film. Absent-mindedly, he popped open the back. To his surprise, a roll of film sat inside the frame counter, stuck at 24. "Dad, what were you working on out here?" he whispered. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then he laughed quietly, a sound halfway between disbelief and sorrow. "You want me to go to town, huh?" Bear tilted his head at the word town, as if recognizing it from another life. Jack hadn't been there in years. He didn't miss people and they didn't miss him. But curiosity, something he hadn't felt in a decade, stirred in his chest. Maybe it was time. He spent the next hour cleaning the camera, gathering the courage to leave his safe cocoon. The simple act of packing for town felt foreign. Jacket, wallet, keys. He hesitated at the door, scanning the quiet forest. The world beyond those trees felt like another planet. "You coming, Buddy Bear?" trotted over, tail wagging once. That was all the permission Jack needed. The truck started with a cough of protest. The road down the mountain was half washed out, the tires crunching over gravel and fallen branches. As they descended, the forest thinned, replaced by glimpses of distant valleys and power lines. Jack hadn't realized how small his world had become until it began to expand again. It took nearly an hour to reach the town of Timberline. The place looked like time had stalled somewhere around 1989. Wooden storefronts, a single gas station, a diner that still had a jukebox by the door. He parked in front of Evergreen Photo Lab, its faded green awning hanging slightly crooked. Through the window he saw shelves lined with old cameras and stacks of film boxes that probably hadn't been touched in years. The bell above the door jingled when he stepped inside. A woman looked up from behind the counter, 40s, maybe 50s, with silver-streaked hair tied in a loose braid and sharp, curious eyes. "Help you?" she asked, voice warm but cautious. Jack cleared his throat. "Got some film that needs developing. Old stuff?" She took the camera from him carefully, her movements precise. "Well, now you're not kidding." She turned it over, smiling faintly. "This model hasn't seen daylight in decades." "Where'd you dig it up?" "My dad's," Jack said. "Found it in the shed." She studied the serial number. "If it's been stored right, we might get lucky." "What's your name, Jack Mercer?" She nodded. "I'm Iris. I'll do my best. No promises it might all come out fogged or blank. But I've had a few miracles in this shop." Jack gave a small nod, not trusting his voice. Iris handed him a claim ticket. "Give me 2 days." He hesitated before leaving. "Thanks. I appreciate it." "Don't thank me yet," she said with a half smile. "Sometimes ghosts hide in film, too." Jack froze mid-step, her words striking something deep inside him. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of wet pine and diesel from the road. He stood there for a long moment, holding the claim ticket like it was a lifeline. The bear watched from the truck, ears perked. Jack finally exhaled. 2 days, huh? He didn't realize he'd said it out loud until Bear barked softly in response. That night back at the cabin, he couldn't sleep. The forest hummed with nocturnal life owls, crickets, the distant rush of a waterfall he'd never actually visited. He sat by the fireplace, turning the camera's empty casing over in his hands, the ghost of his father's touch still clinging to it. For the first time in years, he wondered what his old man had been chasing out there with his lens. When morning came, Jack poured a cup of coffee and stared at the rising mist over the trees. Something was shifting inside him, a quiet unrest. Bear nudged his knee. Jack smiled faintly. "You feel it too, huh?" The dog barked once, sharp and certain. Jack looked toward the mountains where clouds gathered over the ridge like bruises. He didn't know what was waiting for him out there, truth ghosts or nothing at all. But the idea of finding out no longer scared him. "All right," he said softly. "Let's see what's hiding in that film." He didn't notice the faint shape watching from the tree line as he shut the door. 2 days later, Iris Lane would open that camera's secret, and the forgotten wilderness of Silent Falls would begin to call Jack Mercer home again. The bell above the door jingled again. Jack stepped inside Evergreen Photo Lab, with his shoulders hunched against the wind, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his faded canvas jacket. Bear padded beside him, silent as ever, sniffing at the floor before settling near the door. 2 days had passed, and they had been long ones filled with pacing restlessness and far too many walks that led nowhere. Iris Lane looked up from the counter glasses sliding down her nose. She gave a small, unreadable smile. "Didn't think I'd see you back so soon." Jack didn't answer at first. He looked around the shop, letting his eyes settle on the dust-coated shelves of film canisters, old Rolleiflex displays, and framed black and white prints of landscapes from long before cell towers scarred the skyline. "You said 2 days," he said finally. "It's been 2. Iris reached under the counter and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. "You're right. You're exactly on time." Jack took a breath and stepped forward. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. The way Iris handled it with a kind of reverence and hesitation made him pause. "Do you get anything?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Oh, we got something." Jack's eyes narrowed. "What kind of something?" Iris motioned to the back of the shop. "Come on. I think you'll want to look at this sitting down." She led him to a small table near the back beside an ancient darkroom sink and a shelf stacked with binders of processed negatives. Bear followed close, alert but calm, watching Iris as if she were handling explosives. Iris slid the photos out of the envelope and laid them on the table face down. "Before you look, your film wasn't just preserved. It was practically perfect. Whatever case that camera was stored in airtight. The emulsion held better than anything I've seen from the 70s. Jack gave a small nod. His hands hovered over the stack. "I think your father was trying to tell someone something," Iris added, then leaned back in her chair. Jack turned over the first photo, a beam of golden light slicing through a thick pine canopy. The second, a deer startled mid-step, its body a blur against the background of mist and moss. More followed intricate shots of frost patterns on leaves, an eagle perched on a cliff edge, the early morning shimmer over a still lake. Every one of them is quiet, majestic, alive. Jack's throat tightened. It was his father's eye, no doubt. The man had seen the world not just as it was, but as it might be remembered. Reverent, patient, searching. Then he flipped the next photo and froze. This one was different, a tangle of metal twisted into the shape of a 3-bladed propeller. One blade bent backward, unnaturally, rust crawling along its edges. It was half buried in rock, drenched in shadow. He pushed that one aside with shaking fingers and turned over the next. A tail section. Cessna barely legible through moss and grime. The plane was embedded into a rocky ravine wall. Vines crawled across the fuselage, nature swallowing it whole. Jack looked up at Iris, who was watching him closely. And then came the last one. A waterfall. Tall, slender, cascading down a sheer cliff face. At first it looked like a perfect nature shot until Jack spotted it. Half concealed behind the falling water, buried in shadow and mist, was the shape of the aircraft's fuselage. The nose down, crumpled, a metal tomb hidden for decades. He didn't speak. Iris broke the silence. Not every picture is meant to be seen, but this one needs to be. Jack's jaw clenched. "Where is that? I don't know," she admitted. "But it's close. Judging by the terrain and the trees, somewhere in Mount Hood. Maybe even in one of the restricted zones." Jack reached for the final photo again, holding it up to the light. He studied the cliff face, the way the ridgeline curved behind the fall and the faint peak that rose behind it. It hit him like a jolt. "I know that ridge," he muttered. "My dad took me there once when I was a kid. Just a day hike. He said it was his favorite spot, way off trail. He called it the Silent Water." "Silent Falls?" Iris asked. Jack nodded slowly. Yeah, that's what it was. Silent Falls." Iris crossed her arms. You think that wreck is still there? I don't think anybody's ever found it. He stared down at the photos. And I don't think my dad just stumbled on it either. He didn't leave these behind by accident. Maybe he meant for you to find them, she said. Jack didn't answer. The weight in his chest was too heavy. His father had spent a lifetime photographing beauty, and maybe a single moment capturing a buried truth. He stood. I need a copy of these. I already printed you a set. Negatives, too. He met her eyes, saw the flicker of something curiosity, concern. Maybe both. Are you heading up there? She asked. Jack gave a slight nod. Are you sure that's a good idea? Nope. Then why do it? He looked at the waterfall photo again. Because someone died up there, and nobody seems to remember. She didn't try to stop him. Instead, she walked back to the front counter and returned with a thin, dog-eared notebook. My brother was a ranger, she said, before he passed. He used to write down all the unofficial landmarks people talked about, but never made it on the maps. There's a mention of Silent Falls in here dated back to '78. You might find something useful. Jack accepted it with quiet gratitude. Thanks. As he turned to leave, Iris called out softly, Jack, he paused. Be careful. That place looks like it didn't want to be found. The drive back up the mountain was silent. Bear rode shotgun, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Jack, like he could feel the storm brewing beneath his skin. Jack clutched the envelope of photos in one hand, the notebook Iris had given him tucked under his leg. By the time they pulled into the clearing near the cabin, dusk had swallowed the woods. The mist was thick again, curling between the trees like smoke. Jack stood on the porch for a long while, the waterfall photo in his hand, lit by the last orange rays of the dying sun. He knew what he had to do. Inside the cabin, he rolled out old topographical maps onto the kitchen table. He triangulated the ridgeline from the photo with known peaks around the southern edge of Mount Hood. The location was remote, deep in protected forest, far from marked trails. Bear sat by the door, watching tail slowly tapping the wood floor. Jack ran a hand through his hair. Looks like we're going on a trip. The dog's ears perked up its tail, giving a more solid thump. Jack pulled out his old field pack, dusted off a climbing harness, checked the state of his rope. Everything was old, but it would hold. It had to. He pinned the photo of the waterfall to the map with a pocket knife. The edge of the fuselage in that image whispered a promise he couldn't ignore. Tomorrow he'd talk to the only man who might know how to reach that place, the one who'd patrolled these woods longer than anyone else. Marshal Griggs. By the time night fell, the wind was howling outside and the trees were shifting like ghosts. Jack sat by the fire, fingers tight around a mug of bitter coffee, Bear asleep at his feet. In the flickering light, the image of the waterfall stared back at him from the table, daring him to come find what it had hidden for 40 years. Tomorrow he will answer. The old truck rattled up the gravel road tires, spitting stones behind it, as Jack gripped the wheel with one hand and tapped the folder of photos with the other. Bear lay across the passenger seat, head resting on his paws, eyes flicking open every time the road jerked beneath them. Jack hadn't been out this way in years, not since the old days when his father would load him into the same rust-bitten truck and head for the ranger station just outside Hood River. They'd called it Base Camp, a squat log building on the edge of the timberline. Back then, it smelled like coffee, wet wool, and pine sap. He pulled in just as the wind began to kick dust through the lot. The building still stood weather-beaten but sturdy. A faded sign swung on rusted hinges, Mount Hood Forest Service Outpost 9. A man sat on the porch in a creaking chair, flannel sleeves rolled to the elbows, boots caked in dry mud. He didn't look up as Jack stepped out of the truck, but Bear barked once, sharp and familiar. The man's eyes narrowed behind square-framed glasses. Well, hell. Look what the trees dragged in. Hey, Marshall, Jack said, lifting the photo envelope. Got a minute? Marshall Griggs stood his joints cracking in protest. His beard had gone completely white, but the man was still built like a storm shelter, thick in the shoulders, grounded in his stance. He gave Bear a scratch behind the ears. Didn't think I'd see you again, he said. Last I heard you went full mountain hermit. Jack gave a half smile. Still am. Just needed a second opinion. They sat at the picnic table behind the station overlooking a slope of lodgepole pines. The air smelled of wood smoke and dry earth. Jack spread out the photos. Marshall didn't say a word at first. He just stared. When he finally did speak, his voice was quieter than expected. Damn. You recognize it? Jack asked. Yeah, that's Silent Falls, or what we used to call it. Jack looked up sharply. So it's real. Oh, it's real. Marshall tapped the photo of the plane's tail. But you're not going to find it on any official trail map. After the '78 fire, that whole quadrant was restricted. Too dangerous. Mudslides, sinkholes, wildlife reclaiming it. That area was red-zoned, and then conveniently forgotten. Convenient for who Marshall didn't answer immediately. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he did when he was weighing truth against consequence. Have you ever heard of Cascade Timber Group, he asked. Jack nodded. Private contractors. Logged the southern side back in the day. More than that. They had contracts with the state, unofficial deals with the feds. When the fire happened, they jumped on it, claiming whole acres were compromised, filed emergency clearance permits, cut more than they were allowed. Some of us questioned it, but we got stonewalled. And then, a week later, a plane went missing in that sector. Jack's gut clenched. You're saying the wreck in the photo, I'm saying someone didn't want that area found again. And you just found it. They sat in silence. Bear watched them both ears up, sensing the tension. Jack tapped the waterfall photo. You know how to get there, not directly. But I can get you close. Marshall stood, disappeared into the outpost, and returned with a binder so old its leather cracked when he opened it. Inside were hand-drawn maps, notes, old ranger logs. Back then we weren't using GPS, we logged everything manually. I marked a ridge here. He pointed to a bend in the elevation lines. Used to be called Dead Elk Crest. About 2 miles east there's a cliff face. The falls are just beyond that. You'll have to go off trail. Jack studied the lines, committing them to memory. Marshall looked at him, his face suddenly grave. Jack, listen. If you go looking for what the forest forgot, you better be ready for it to remember you. Jack held his gaze. I'm not going in blind. No, but you're going in alone. And I don't just mean people. There are things out there, old injuries. The forest doesn't forget them. Neither do the men who made them. Jack folded the map carefully. I don't care about the timber company or whoever buried that plane. I care about what's still up there. Someone died. They deserve to be found. Marshall nodded slowly. You always were your father's son. Before Jack left, Marshall handed him a small orange beacon. Emergency transmitter. Hit this if you break a leg or fall into a ravine. Otherwise, no one's coming for you. Jack took it and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Appreciate it. Bear jumped into the truck like he already knew they weren't going home just yet. As Jack backed out of the lot, Marshall called after him. Jack, he stopped. If you find what I think you're gonna find, be careful who you tell. That night, Jack pored over the ranger map at the cabin, cross-referencing it with his father's photos and the notes Iris had given him. The three sources painted a picture of an invisible trail only a ghost would know. He highlighted a path with red chalk, traced possible ridgelines, and considered weather patterns. There was a 3-day window of clear skies. After that, the autumn storms would roll in hard. He packed lightly climbing rope, a camp stove, first aid kit, satellite compass food for 4 days. He checked and rechecked Bear's harness. The dog stood patiently, used to the pre-trip ritual. Jack stared at the waterfall photo one last time, thumb resting on the edge of the image. The wreck was still out there, forgotten, swallowed whole. Not anymore. Before dawn, Jack left a note taped to the inside of his door. Gone to find the falls. Back in 5 days. If not, tell Marshal Griggs. He clipped the photo of the fuselage behind the waterfall into his journal, zipped it inside a waterproof sleeve, and shoved it into the bottom of his pack. Bear hopped into the truck bed, wind already in his ears, as Jack took the winding logging road toward the Dead Elk trailhead. The trees grew denser the higher they climbed, towering over the single-lane road like silent witnesses. When they reached the trailhead, Jack parked the truck behind a grove of dense cedar out of sight. He slung the pack over his shoulder, checked his compass, and started walking. The forest greeted him with hush and shadow. Bear took the lead, ears, sharp nose to the ground. The trees closed behind them like a gate. Jack didn't look back. He was heading into the forgotten, and the forest had just remembered him. The forest was different here. It wasn't just the silence, it was the weight of it. Jack had hiked deeper into Mount Hood's backcountry than most ever dared, but this stretch of land felt untouched, almost untouched by time. The canopy overhead grew thick, blotting out the sun. Only streaks of light broke through landing like forgotten prayers on the moss-carpeted ground. Bear walked ahead, nose twitching his paws, barely making a sound on the earth. Jack moved behind him, careful, deliberate. Every crack of a twig beneath his boots felt too loud. The trail they followed wasn't marked. It didn't even deserve to be called a trail. More like an echo of something once known, now reclaimed by time and growth. They had been hiking for hours. Jack's muscles burned from the weight of the pack, and sweat had soaked through his shirt despite the cold air. But the photos kept him going, the ridge, the waterfall, the hidden plain. They were close. He could feel it. Still, something was off. At first, it was just a strange absence. No bird song, no rustling squirrels, no bugs buzzing in his ears. Just wind threading through the trees like a whisper too low to understand. Then he noticed the trees themselves. Older here, taller, gnarled in ways he hadn't seen in years. Several had large gouges in their bark, unnatural, sharp, almost purposeful. The bear suddenly stopped. His body stiffened, ears tilted forward, tail frozen mid-wag. Jack knelt beside him, lowering his voice to a whisper. "What is it, buddy?" The bear didn't move. His gaze was fixed ahead into the thick undergrowth. Jack followed it. That's when he saw it just barely visible between two massive trunks. Something metallic. Something is wrong. He crept forward, brushing branches aside. It wasn't the plane. It was a trap. A steel bear trap, jaws wide open, rust flaking off the edges, but still sharp enough to cut bone. It was rigged with a pressure plate hidden beneath a false pile of leaves and pine needles. Jack sucked in a breath. Jesus. He crouched beside it and examined the setup. This wasn't left here decades ago. This was recent. Someone had been through here. Someone who didn't want company. Bear let out a soft growl. Jack stood slowly, scanning the woods. We're not alone. They pressed on more carefully now. Jack marked trees with small strips of orange cloth from his pack of quiet breadcrumbs in case they needed to get out fast. They hiked another mile before the terrain shifted again. The trees opened slightly, revealing a steep incline slick with damp moss and broken stone. At the top, a jagged outcrop jutted from the forest like a broken tooth. Jack paused and pointed toward the ridge. That's it. That's the ridge from the photo. Bear barked once in response and surged forward, tail raised. As they climbed, the air grew colder. Clouds rolled in above, casting the ridge in dusky shadow. Jack could hear water now, a distant, steady rush. His heart quickened. They reached the top just as the last light broke through the trees. And there it was. Silent Falls. A curtain of water poured over the edge of a cliff, vanishing into a rocky basin below. Mist rose like breath from the forest floor. The roar of it was softer than expected almost, reserved, like the waterfall itself was hiding something. Jack stood at the edge, staring. The memory of the photo clicked into place. The angle was slightly different, but the terrain matched the cliff face, the slope of the surrounding rock, the twisted tree on the edge. His father had stood here. I had seen this. He moved slowly along the cliff, bare, close behind. Vines and moss covered the edges of the rock face. Behind the waterfall was a shallow alcove carved into the wall, and in the shadows, barely visible, something glinted. Jack's breath caught. He stepped closer, peering through the mist. It was metal. Fuselage. The wreck. He couldn't make out much from here. Just the curve of the nose and a hint of crumpled metal beneath layers of moss and vines. But it was real. Jack exhaled sharply. We found it. Bear barked again, tail wagging but cautiously. Jack turned to him and knelt, placing a hand on his side. The forest buried it, but it didn't erase it. They made camp just a few yards off the cliff. Jack didn't want to risk climbing down until first light. The terrain around the basin was slick, unstable. One wrong move and it'd be a long drop to a hard landing. That night, as they sat by a small, smokeless fire, Jack flipped through the photos again, comparing them to the real thing. Everything matched. His father must have found the plane, and then kept it secret. Why? What had he known that made him hide something like this? Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As the fire crackled, Bear lifted his head. His ears twitched. Then he growled. Jack froze. What is it? The forest around them was still. But then Jack heard it move too softly. A shuffle through leaves. A footstep. He reached for his flashlight and turned it toward the sound, heart pounding. The beam cut through the darkness. Nothing. Another sound. Closer. Jack stood slowly, every muscle in his body taut. And then silence. Deep, swallowing silence. He waited for minutes that felt like hours. But nothing came. Still the feeling lingered. They were being watched. At dawn, Jack packed up quickly. The sky was overcast but dry. He rigged a rope to a nearby tree and began the descent into the basin behind the waterfall. Bear stayed at the top, whining as Jack lowered himself inch by careful inch. The air was damp, filled with mist. The rocks were slick beneath his boots. When he reached the alcove, he finally saw it up close. The plane's nose was crushed, caved in from the impact. One wing was twisted beneath the fuselage. The metal was discolored, streaked with time and water. But inside, just behind the shattered windshield, bones. The remains of a man slumped in the pilot's seat, still strapped in. A sun-bleached skull stared forward, and next to him a metal case. Jack reached in slowly, prying it loose from years of rust and rot. The latches were corroded, but still functional. He popped them open. Inside, wrapped in plastic and sealed in waterproof lining, a journal. On the cover in faded ink, Daniel Rowe. Jack stared at the name, heart thudding. Who the hell was Daniel Rowe? And what the hell was he doing flying into a forest no one was supposed to enter? Jack tucked the journal into his pack, climbed back up to Bear, and sat down hard, the weight of the discovery settling in. He hadn't just found a wreck. He'd found a story someone had tried very hard to bury, and now he had the first piece. He looked at Bear and said, "We're not done here." Bear barked once. Behind them, the forest stirred again, and something or someone was still watching. The wind had picked up by the time Jack and Bear made it back to their temporary camp. The trees swayed with slow menace, their creaking branches echoing like old bones rubbing together. Jack kept glancing over his shoulder, every rustle now louder than before, every shadow stretching just a little too long. The journal in his pack felt radioactive. He knelt by the fire pit, rekindling a flame with dry twigs and pine needles needing warmth light, and a barrier between him and whatever watched from the trees. He opened the case again and carefully slid out the journal. It was thick, worn, bound in cracked leather pages, yellowed but dry. The name Daniel Rowe stared back at him, handwritten and underlined. "All right, Daniel," Jack muttered. "What the hell were you doing up here?" He flipped to the first page. The handwriting was clean, confident, with the kind of control you only get from field reporters and people used to writing in chaos. June 3rd, 1982. I don't know who will read this, if anyone does. But I'm writing it all down because I've learned one thing out here: truth rots if you keep it buried. Jack's fingers tightened around the page. He kept reading. They told me this was a ghost story, that people vanish in these woods. But people don't vanish. They're made to disappear. The company is lying. They're clearing land beyond the fire zones. Old-growth forest, sacred land. And when they're confronted, those people get lost. Hikers, activists, journalists. I'm here because one of them was my friend. Jamie didn't vanish. He was silenced. Jack's stomach twisted. Tomorrow I'll fly over the zone again. I've got photos, names, coordinates. I just need to get them to someone who'll listen. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it out. But the truth is in these pages. Don't let them bury it again. Jack turned the pages faster now. Maps, names, sketches of clear-cut lines and photographs marked with timestamps. He found a hand-drawn blueprint of a facility hidden deep in the forest, labeled simply Site 9. According to Rowe, it wasn't on any map, but it existed. A storage site for chemicals, possibly defoliants. Off the books, no oversight. And then came the real hammer blow. I have a contact. I live alone. Said he used to work maintenance for Cascade Timber. Named Simon. Last I heard, he went off-grid years ago. Still somewhere north of Dead Elk Crest. If anyone can prove what happened, it's him. But he's scared. They all are. Jack leaned back, stunned. Simon. That name. It triggered something. His father had mentioned someone by that name once, a loner who'd left the company after something tien. Jack had assumed it was just cabin talk. But now, Simon's real Jack said aloud, and he might still be out here. Bear gave a low whine, sensing the tension. Jack closed the journal gently and looked out toward the forest. Truth doesn't rot by itself, he said. Someone always helps bury it. By mid-morning, Jack had packed up camp and marked the crash site with a red flag on his map. He didn't want to leave it, but he had no choice. If Simon was still alive, he was the next piece of the puzzle. And Jack wasn't going to lose momentum now, not when he was this close. He cut northwest, staying above the low ridges and following animal trails when possible. The terrain was rougher here, more unpredictable. Sections of land sloped suddenly like old landslides had reshaped the forest in ways the maps never accounted for. The bear stayed alert, ears twitching, sniffing the wind constantly. About 2 hours in, Jack spotted the first sign: a wire snare, rusted, but recently placed, tied between two trees. Not for hunting, for warning. A perimeter. He crouched and scanned the surrounding woods. Nothing moved. Nothing called. Just the wind and the ever-present hum of nature, holding its breath. Another mile forward, he found an old hunting blind, camouflaged under dead brush elevated just off the ground. Someone had used it not long ago. There were fresh droppings near the ladder, and a single tin cup left on the small platform. Jack felt eyes on him the entire time. Finally, as the sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting everything in a dim amber wash, he saw smoke, thin, faint, curling from the ridgeline up ahead. Bear stopped and looked back at him. Jack whispered, "Looks like Simon didn't vanish after all." They moved slowly toward the source. The smoke led them to a camouflaged cabin, nothing more than a shack really built into the side of a slope, half covered with moss and brambles. A makeshift fence surrounded it, barely visible under overgrowth. Jack stopped outside the perimeter and called out, voice steady but loud enough to carry. "I'm not with the company. I'm not a ranger. My name's Jack Mercer. I found the crash." Silence. Then the distinct sound of a bolt sliding on a rifle. I said back up, a rough voice barked from inside the trees. "I don't care who you are." Jack didn't move. "Daniel Rowe wrote about you. I have his journal." Another long pause. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. A figure emerged from the underbrush, older man, beard down to his collarbone, face weathered like tree bark. He held a rifle aimed low but ready. His eyes, sharp and untrusting, narrowed at Jack. "You found the plane?" he asked. Jack nodded and slowly opened his pack. He pulled out the journal and offered it forward. The man stared at it, his hand trembling slightly. Then he lowered the rifle. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "He made it that far." Jack nodded. "He died trying to expose it. Now I need your help to finish what he started." Simon didn't speak for a long time. Then he turned and walked back toward the cabin. "Come inside," he muttered, "but keep the dog out." "I've got traps." Jack raised a hand. "Bear stays. He's not just a dog." Simon grunted but didn't argue. Inside the shack, the air was stale with old paper and ash. Maps lined the walls. Red strings connected points across an old forestry map. Notes scribbled in the margins. Clippings. Names. Photos. It was a bunker of guilt and evidence. Simon poured a cup of water and sat across from Jack. He looked tired, like decades of silence were finally wearing through. "I didn't want to be part of it," he said. "I didn't know what they were doing. I just worked the engines, repaired gear, and kept quiet. Then I saw the manifest barrels marked soil treatment with hazard codes that didn't match." He pointed to a name written on the wall, Site 9. They stored it there. Hidden tanks deep underground. No oversight. They dumped half of it near protected zones and blamed the fire for the environmental damage. Paid off whoever asked questions. And the plane, Jack asked. Simon's voice dropped. Roe was going to expose them. I warned him not to fly alone. I thought I could fix the engine and give him a head start, but they got to him first. Sabotaged the tail, made it look like an accident. Jack stared at him. And you've stayed here all this time? Simon laughed bitter. Some people carry guilt. I built a cabin for it. Jack leaned forward. I need coordinates. Proof. Whatever you can give me. Simon reached for a small locked case beneath his desk. He opened it slowly and handed Jack a bundle of documents, blueprints, photos, names. You want to dig up ghosts, Simon said. Start here. Jack took them, eyes scanning the details. What are you going to do now? Simon asked. Jack looked up. His voice was quiet but firm. I'm going to burn down everything they tried to hide. And outside the window, the woods shifted again, as if something in them had just been awakened. Night came hard and fast, bringing with it a cold that crept under Jack's skin and settled deep in his bones. Inside Simon's cabin, the fire crackled low, casting shifting shadows across the walls covered in documents and regret. Jack sat at the table, Daniel Rowe's journal, and Simon's files spread out before him, like a puzzle assembled too late. Simon paced slowly, cradling a mug of something strong and bitter. His eyes had a faraway look, like he wasn't fully in the room anymore. They sent 2 men after Rowe. Simon said, his voice barely above a whisper, not just to stop him, to make sure no one ever knew. I think one of them is still out there. Jack looked up sharply. Still out there, you mean? Alive, Simon nodded. Name's Dwyer, ex-military, cold, efficient. He disappeared after the cleanup. Word is he stayed in the woods, watching, waiting. Jack processed that, then glanced toward the window. The woods outside were pitch black, the silence pressing like weight on the glass. You think he's watching us now? Wouldn't surprise me, Simon muttered. Jack tapped the map. I need to get to Site 9. If even half of what you and Rowe documented is true, then there's enough in those storage tanks to poison the watershed for decades. Simon moved to the far side of the cabin and dragged out a metal ammo case. From inside, he retrieved a battered GPS unit, a waterproof pouch filled with microfilm slides, and a flash drive sealed in resin. These were Rowe's backups, he said. Coordinates, names, images. I've kept them safe all these years, just in case. Jack stared at the case. Then it's time. Simon didn't answer right away. Instead, he went to a cabinet and pulled out a long duffel bag. He unzipped it slowly, revealing a shotgun flare gun, 2 canisters of bear spray, and a rusted but functional satellite phone. You're not going alone, he said. I may be old, but I remember the way. You'll need someone who knows what to expect. Jack hesitated. You're sure? Simon met his gaze. I've been hiding for 40 years. Maybe it's time I stop. Outside, Bear whined. Jack turned and saw the dog standing stiff by the door, ears perked. Something's out there, Jack said, moving to the window. The darkness stared back, unmoved. Simon stepped beside him and whispered, Hope it's the wind. They set out before dawn. The trail to Site 9 was buried under decades of growth, but Simon led them with confidence. The terrain got rough, fast, steep ravines, unstable ridgelines, slick moss-covered boulders. Bear moved ahead like a scout nose, twitching constantly. Jack had studied the maps the night before, triangulating the coordinates. According to the overlays, Site 9 was built into an old quarry camouflaged by rock and covered by a false tree line. If it was still intact, it would be buried beneath nature and reinforced by paranoia. Halfway there, they found the first sign of resistance. Tripwires. Jack spotted the glint of filament between two trees just in time. He threw an arm out in front of Simon. There. Simon knelt, eyes narrowed. Dwyer. This is his signature. Non-lethal, but loud. Alert traps, which means he knows we're coming. They dismantled the trap, pushed deeper into the forest. The woods grew hostile. Thorns, sinkholes, false paths marked with misleading signs. Simon muttered as he went cursing the old tactics of men who had something to hide. They made it a maze on purpose, he said. If you don't know the code, you get turned around. Or lost. Or worse, Jack added. By mid-afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a small valley. Jack raised the binoculars. In the center of the basin was a dome of earth, unnatural in shape, too uniform. Trees had been planted across the top to disguise it, but now they were dying, bark-cracked leaves blackened. There it is, Simon said grimly. Site 9. As they prepared to descend, a gunshot rang out loud and sharp. The bark of a tree near Jack's head exploded in splinters. The bear yelped and dropped to the ground. Jack dove behind a rock, heart hammering. Sniper. Simon yanked the flare gun from his bag. He's hurting us, trying to force us into the basin. We go down, we're boxed in. Jack scanned the tree line and caught a flash of movement of a man in camo rifle slung, moving fast, but calculated. Dwyer, Simon hissed. Son of a bitch is still breathing. We can't engage, Jack said. We get to the facility, expose what's there. That's how we end this. Another bullet cracked off the rock. Simon popped the flare, sending red fire into the sky. The distraction gave them just enough time to sprint down the slope and dive into a stand of brush. The bear kept close, panting, but unhurt. Jack gritted his teeth, adrenaline spiking. They were within reach of the truth and now being hunted. They reached the outer perimeter of the dome just as the light began to fade. Simon found the entry, a rusted maintenance hatch, half buried under dead leaves. Once we go in, Simon said, voice low, there's no turning back. Jack looked at him, then toward the trees. Let him come. Let him try. But he won't stop this. Not now. They opened the hatch and disappeared into the dark. The hatch groaned as it opened, revealing a steep iron staircase swallowed by shadow. A foul chemical stench rolled up from below, something sharp, metallic, and ancient. Jack clicked on his flashlight and descended, first bear at his heels. Simon followed, closing the hatch behind them and plunging them into darkness. The stairs creaked with every step, the metal rusted from decades of condensation and neglect. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, as if the silence itself had weight. The stairwell ended in a narrow corridor reinforced with concrete. Pipes lined the ceiling, some dripping moisture, others coated in flaking insulation. The walls were tagged with faded stencils, restricted. Site 9 and authorized personnel only. Simon swept his light across the walls, murmuring like he was reciting from memory. This was a storage site, but it doubled as a lab. A lot of what they were testing here wasn't just defoliants. It was neurological, experimental. On people, Jack asked. Simon didn't answer. He just pointed down the hall. The main records room is through there. If the servers survived, they might hold what you need. They moved carefully, stepping over debris, fallen ceiling panels, collapsed ductwork, broken carts. Bear sniffed every doorframe and corner alert, but calm. The main chamber opened like a wound. A large circular room filled with overturned desks, smashed monitors, file cabinets covered in grime. On one wall stood a sealed metal vault labeled Archives. Jack approached it and brushed the dust off the keypad. It's intact. Simon moved beside him. Roe knew the code. He told me once that it was symbolic. Jack looked at him. You remember it, Simon hesitated, then slowly pressed the numbers 1 to 963. The panel beeped. A mechanical click echoed, and the door creaked open. Inside, floor-to-ceiling shelves groaned under the weight of paper files, plastic binders, and canisters. Rows of film reels and backup drives lined the shelves. The room had a sterile chill even after all these years. Jack stepped in awe and anger mixing inside him. They kept everything. Simon pulled down a box and opened it. Inside were photos, black and white, grainy, showing barrels being buried in pits, workers in hazmat suits, and in one photo, unmistakable, a young Daniel Rowe, camera in hand, being pulled away by two men. Simon stared at it. That's the day he disappeared. Jack's fingers tightened on the box. We document everything. Get it on camera. We blow this open. He turned and looked at Simon. We send the truth back into the world. Suddenly, Bear growled low in his throat. Jack froze. What is it? The bear growled again, then barked once, sharp and urgent. Jack extinguished the flashlight. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Heavy, deliberate approaching. Simon whispered, "He found us." Jack pulled his sidearm from his belt and crouched behind the metal filing cabinets. Bear took position beside him, muscles coiled. The footsteps stopped just outside the records room. Then silence. A second later, a flashbang rolled through the door. Down. Jack shouted, diving to the floor. The blast hit like a hammer-light sound and pressure. Jack's ears rang and the world spun. Bear yelped. Simon cursed. Through the disorientation, Jack saw a figure enter. Tall. Tactical gear. Rifle up. Night vision goggles glowing green. Dwyer. Jack fired twice, but the shots missed, ricocheting off the walls. Dwyer moved fast, too fast for a man his age should. He returned fire, forcing Jack deeper into the room. Simon threw a chair, buying Jack a second to lunge behind a desk. We're pinned, Jack shouted. Simon tossed the flare gun across the floor. Use it! Jack grabbed it, waited for Dwyer's shadow, then fired. The flare erupted in blinding red light, flooding the room with sudden brightness. Dwyer stumbled back, momentarily blinded. Jack tackled him. The two men crashed into a shelving unit, sending files and boxes tumbling. Dwyer was stronger, but Jack was fueled by fury. They grappled, fists landing, elbows cracking against bone. Dwyer punched Jack across the face and slammed him against the wall. You don't get to unbury this, he growled. We kept peace. We buried the poison so the world could move on. Jack spit blood. You didn't bury poison. You buried people. He headbutted Dwyer and knocked him off balance. Simon fired the bear spray, the blast engulfing Dwyer's face. The older man screamed and dropped his weapon, clawing at his eyes. Jack tackled him again and pinned him down, wrenching his arms behind his back. The bear barked furiously, circling. End it, Simon yelled. But Jack didn't. He stood chest-heaving, gun trained on Dwyer. No, he said. You don't get silence. You get the truth. He looked at Simon. We leave him. Tied. Let the feds pick him up. He's living proof this happened. Simon looked down at the man who had haunted him for decades. He nodded slowly. They tied Dwyer's hands with zip cords, then dragged him to a secure room and locked the door. Now, Jack said, we gather everything. For the next hour, they loaded up drives, film reels, documents, anything that could expose what had happened in Site 9. Every file confirmed what Rowe had died trying to prove: illegal dumping of chemicals, unauthorized testing, silenced whistleblowers. There were names: corporate, political, military. Jack stared at one page listing payouts to families whose missing relatives were declared accidental deaths. How many families never knew, he whispered. Simon stood beside him. Too many. Finally, when their packs were stuffed and Jack had photographed everything he could, they made their way back toward the exit hatch. Just before they left, Jack turned back and looked at the archives one last time. This place is a tomb, but not for secrets anymore. They emerged into the dying light of day. The forest was quite eerily so. Jack looked at the sky. We have proof now. We can make it matter. Simon stared at the treetops, then whispered, "Then we finish this. Public. Loud. No more shadows." As they started down the trail, Jack felt something had shifted. The truth wasn't buried anymore, and the world would have to face it. You don't get silence. You get the truth. The words hung between them as they disappeared into the trees. The rain started as they cleared the tree line, sharp, stinging drops that soaked through Jack's jacket and turned the trail to mud. The sky above was gunmetal gray, low clouds clinging to the ridge like smoke from a battlefield. Bear trotted ahead, ears pinned back his steps, uncertain in the wet earth. Jack adjusted his pack, weighed down by flash drives, photos, and decades of silence. Beside him, Simon walked slower than before, favoring his left leg where he'd twisted it during the struggle underground. Neither of them spoke much, not because they didn't have things to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said in Site 9. They were 2 miles from the truck when they saw the first sign of trouble. A drone. It hovered high above the trees, nearly silent but unmistakable. A black wasp against a bruised sky. Jack froze. They're watching us. Simon shielded his eyes. Not just watching. They're tracking. Jack felt a chill deeper than the rain. How fast do you think they'll move? Simon exhaled. Fast enough. They picked up pace. Jack checked the satellite phone signal bars, blinking weak but alive. He punched in Marshall's number. 1 ring, 2, static. Come on, pick up. Mercer Marshall's voice cut through. Where the hell have you been, still in the forest? We found Site 9, we have evidence, hard proof, dead air. Then is it enough? It's more than enough. I need you to call Iris. We're going public. Everything, press, agencies, everyone. You think they'll let you? They won't have a choice, Jack said. Just buy us time. We're almost out. Copy that, Marshall said, then lowered his voice. And Jack, whatever happens, make sure the truth doesn't die in the woods again. Jack hung up. Simon looked at him. We're not going to make it to the truck. Jack nodded. They'll block the road. Maybe even scrub the site before we get a signal strong enough. So what then? Jack pulled out the topo map and pointed to an old ranger tower about a mile east. That tower's still standing. Simon squinted. Last I heard, yeah. Solar-powered. Built to survive blizzards. Might still have a relay antenna. Jack rolled the map. Then that's where we send the story. They cut through the trees, scrambling across slick rocks and fallen logs. The drone followed always in the periphery like a mechanical ghost. As they crested the last ridge before the tower, a black SUV tore through the woods below custom tires unmarked. Government or private matters didn't matter. They were here to clean up. They'll be here in minutes, Simon warned. They sprinted the last quarter mile. The tower loomed ahead, rusted but intact, a steel skeleton rising out of the trees. Jack's heart pounded as they climbed the stairs, each step echoing into the forest below. Bear barked once, then darted ahead to the door, sniffing anxiously. Inside the room was sparse, a weathered desk, a dusty cot, and miraculously, a satellite uplink terminal still humming with faint power. Jack dropped his pack, yanked the flash drive from its case, and plugged it in. "Come on! Come on!" He launched the transfer documents, images, coordinates, everything uploading to a secure cloud server he'd configured before the trip. Bear growled. Simon looked out the window. "They're coming up." "Just a few more minutes," Jack said. He looked at the screen. 48%, 52%, 61%. Shots rang out below, echoing through the forest. The sound of boots on metal stairs. Simon grabbed the shotgun. Jack grabbed his camera. "They can erase bodies," Jack said, "but not what's already out there." The transfer hit 100%. Jack pulled the drive, tucked it into Bear's vest, then activated a beacon inside the collar. Simon looked at him. "What are you doing?" Jack gave Bear a firm pat. "Run. Find Marshall." "Go." Bear hesitated, then bolted down the stairs, silent and fast. Simon turned back. "They're not going to let us walk away from this." Jack stepped to the center of the room, looked out the window as dark figures emerged from the trees. His voice was steady. "If we don't walk out of here, we make sure the story does." They barricaded the door. Down below, a voice called out through a bullhorn. "Mr. Mercer, Mr. Hawthorne. Step out now, and no one has to get hurt." Jack scoffed. "Is that the best they've got?" As Simon cracked the window. "We got a better offer." Jack grabbed the flare gun from his belt and fired straight into the air. A streak of light cut across the gray sky. From somewhere far off, a second flare responded, red and bright. Marshall had gotten the message. "They know," Jack said, "and now they're watching too." The door downstairs slammed open. Jack looked at Simon. "Time to buy the truth for a few more minutes." Simon cocked the shotgun. "Let's show them what guilt looks like when it fights back." They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, as the door behind them burst open. Outside, the forest remained still, but above, satellites blinked. Hard drives turned, and across the country, servers lit up with the story. The news didn't break. It exploded. Within 24 hours, headlines flashed across every major network. Secret chemical site uncovered in Oregon wilderness. Whistleblower journal surfaces. Decades after disappearance. Former timber executive implicated in environmental cover-up. Iris Chan, the young independent journalist Jack had reached out to weeks before, became the face of the firestorm. She stood in front of a projector, holding Rose's journal in one hand and displaying surveillance footage, satellite images, and archival documents. She didn't water it down. She named names, companies, military contractors, politicians, the whole network that had profited from decades of silence, and she made it personal. She read from Rose's journal. She showed a photo of Jack and Bear from their last call. Then she held up a bloodied vest Bear's recovered at the base of the Ranger Tower. No sign of Jack. No confirmation of his fate. Just that one image burned into every screen in America. The public didn't just listen, they lit up. Protests erupted. Government agencies scrambled. Investigations were launched overnight. Whistleblower hotlines overflowed. And slowly, stories began trickling out. Other hidden sites. Suppressed reports. Missing persons cases that had long been ruled as accidents. Everything Roe warned about was finally crawling into the light. Still, one question lingered in every headline, on every broadcast. Where is Jack Mercer, miles away from the firestorm? Deep in the Cascade Mountains, a small log cabin stood silent under the weight of snow and smoke. Inside, Jack stirred. Pain pulsed through his ribs. His vision swam. The last thing he remembered was the tower door crashing open, boots stomping up the stairs, a flash of light, and then nothing. He opened his eyes. He wasn't dead. He was somewhere else. Bandages wrapped his chest and shoulder. A wood stove hissed softly. A kettle whistled faintly in the background. And across from him, sitting in a rocking chair, was an old woman with sharp eyes and a rifle across her knees. "You're lucky I was tracking deer when that thing started barking his head off," she said. "Found him dragging your body toward the river." Jack's throat was dry. "Bear," she nodded. "Smartest damn dog I've ever met." Almost like he knew where to go. Jack coughed. "Who are you?" Leaned forward. "Name's Ruby. Used to run fire watch towers up here in the 70s. I stay off-grid now. Trust me, it's safer." Jack pushed himself upright, wincing. "How long have I been out? Week? Maybe more. You were half frozen, banged up real bad. Whatever you stirred up back there, somebody wanted you buried." Jack stared into the fire. Simon. The tower. The files. The upload. "Did it get out?" he whispered. Ruby nodded slowly. "All of it. That flare lit the whole damn country on fire." Jack leaned back, chest heavy, with a mix of relief and grief. "Simon." Her face tightened. "Didn't find him. Just you and the dog." Jack closed his eyes. His mind replayed the last stand. The moment they chose defiance over silence. The weight of Simon's guilt finally unburdened in that tower. He'd bought Jack enough time, and Jack had kept the promise. Ruby stood and poured him tea. "You need rest, but something tells me you're not the resting type." Jack took the mug, hands trembling. "No, I'm not done." Outside, the snow continued falling. The bear lay curled near the door, one ear flicking every so often. Jack reached for the sat phone on the table. Battery full. A single message from Marshall blinked on the screen. "We need you. They're panicking." Jack turned the device over in his hands. The truth was out, but the battle wasn't over. Now came the harder part, ensuring it stuck, that the system couldn't just spin, it sanitize it or bury it under red tape and plausible deniability. Jack looked at Ruby. "Can I use your radio? I need to talk to someone." She grinned. "You can use whatever the hell you want, hero." By nightfall, Jack sat by the window, Bear's head in his lap, watching the firelight dance on the wooden floor. The tea had helped. So had the silence. But something still gnawed at him. He had exposed the truth. But exposure wasn't the same as justice. And deep down, he knew what was coming next. The people behind Site 9 hadn't disappeared. They hadn't all gone into hiding. Some were regrouping, preparing damage control, spinning narratives. They would lie. They would obfuscate. They would buy silence the way they always had, unless someone forced them to face the weight of what they'd done. Jack stood. Ruby looked up from her stitching. "Where are you going to finish what I started?" She watched him quietly for a long moment. "You sure? Once you step back into that world, there's no crawling back out." Jack strapped on his pack. "Then I won't crawl. I'll burn a path." She smiled. "There it is. The wildfire looks." He turned to Bear, who was already on his feet. "You ready?" The bear gave a short bark tail, swaying. As Jack stepped out into the cold night air, snow crunching underfoot, wind biting at his collar, he glanced back one last time. Ruby stood in the doorway, rifle over her shoulder. Give 'em hell, Mercer, she said, because they damn well deserve it. Jack nodded. His voice is low, steady. The fire's already lit. Now I'm just making sure it spreads. He disappeared into the night, with Bear by his side. And in the distance, sirens began to howl. The hearing room was packed. Wood-paneled walls, rows of cameras, a dozen journalists typing like machine guns. At the front, a long bench of senators and legal aides hunched over files. Flags lined the back wall. Every breath inside the chamber felt tight, controlled, like the truth was being held on a leash, and everyone was waiting to see if it would bite. Jack stood at the witness table, hands steady, voice firm. He was clean-shaven, suit pressed, but there was no mistaking the tension behind his eyes. He wasn't here for theater. He was here for war. Across from him sat Senator Klein, chair of the Environmental Oversight Committee. She adjusted her glasses and leaned in. Mr. Mercer, do you stand by the authenticity of the documents released to the public 2 weeks ago? I do, Jack said. Every file came directly from Site 9, and you claim this facility was buried physically and administratively by a coalition of military contractors and a former timber company executive, yes, with assistance from at least one government official who authorized the original chemical trials. Murmurs broke out. Klein tapped her gavel. Jack continued. We have photographic evidence, signed orders, budget reallocations. All of it was meant to erase what Daniel Rowe discovered. Why wait until now to bring it forward? Klein asked. Jack glanced at the press table. Iris was there watching with quiet intensity. I didn't have the full truth until now. And until I found it, I wasn't going to offer the public anything less. Are you aware, Klein said, that following the release of this data, 3 resignations were submitted from the Department of Defense, and a sealed lawsuit has been reopened in Oregon's District Court, IM. And do you believe your actions could destabilize trust in these institutions? Jack didn't flinch. I believe truth doesn't destabilize trust, it restores it. If a system crumbles under the weight of truth, then it was never strong to begin with. The silence after that line was heavy. One senator coughed. Another scribbled furiously. Klein nodded once. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. Jack stepped down. Behind him, the doors opened. A familiar figure entered Ruby. She stood in the back, nodding at Jack as he passed. Bear was with her tail-wagging bandana freshly tied. A quiet symbol. Proof he'd made it out. That they all had. Outside, the crowd surged. Dozens of protesters lined the Capitol steps, holding up signs, Justice for Roe. Site 9 is just the beginning. Accountability now. Jack and Iris moved through the crowd, flanked by Marshall and 2 independent security contractors. Iris had a tablet under one arm, a recorder clipped to her jacket. She walked like a journalist with blood in the water. You rattled them, she said, keeping pace. They should be rattled. We've confirmed 3 additional sites based on the archive coordinates. Local news is catching on. Jack nodded. Good. Keep feeding it to them. Iris lowered her voice. You're not finished, are you, Jack? Looked ahead. A news van passed by. On its screen, his own face stared back, frozen in mid-sentence, jaw clenched. No, he said. This isn't the end. This is the lever. Now we move the mountain. Later that night, in a secure apartment high above the city, Jack sat with Simon's journal in his hands. Ruby sat across from him, sipping cheap whiskey. You did what he couldn't, she said. Jack shook his head. He did the hard part. I just made sure people finally listened. She studied him for a beat. What's next? Jack opened the journal to a page he hadn't read before. A sketch of Site 9, coordinates scribbled in the margins. But below that, another location, a smaller site. Rowe had marked it with a red X and a note unconfirmed testing ground. Locals call it the Hollow. Jack traced the line. We go deeper, he said. Ruby raised a brow. Are you serious? Jack nodded. If Site 9 was the lid, this might be the rest of the barrel. And they've already started spinning damage control. We can't let this become another news cycle people forget. She raised her glass. To round 2. He tapped him against hers. To dig graves for lies. The next morning, Jack met with Marshall at a private security firm's D.C. office. Maps covered the walls. Dossiers lined the tables. A task force had formed quietly. Ex-military former investigators, retired journalists, people who wanted in. Marshall pointed at the hollow on the map. That area's been cordoned off since the 90s. No official designation, no public access. Whatever it is, they've been guarding it. Jack studied the aerial photos. A pattern of cleared trees, a structure just barely visible beneath the canopy. You think it's active? He asked. Marshall nodded. Or buried deeper than the last one. Iris walked in holding a USB drive. Satellite pinged movement last week. Night drops. No flight logs filed. Jack turned to the group. Then we go. No delays, no leaks. He paused, then added, This time we don't just expose the truth. We dismantle the machine. The room was silent. Then Ruby stood. Guess it's time we remind them what ghosts do when they come back angry. Jack looked around the table. Faces hardened. Purpose clear. He wasn't alone anymore, and they weren't waiting for permission. The next phase had begun. The hollow was silent. Too silent. No birds. No wind. Not even the hum of distant insects. Just a pressing, unnatural stillness that wrapped around Jack and his team as they crept through the moss-laced ravine leading to the unmarked perimeter fence. They had parked the trucks miles back, moved in on foot, and avoided every trail. The satellite images were weeks old, but accurate enough to lead them here just beneath a tree-covered ridge in Northern California, where the map said nothing existed. And yet, here it was. Camouflaged fencing, sensor lines, a flicker of motion-triggered lights beneath thick camouflage netting. The hollow wasn't a myth, it was real, and it was very much alive. Jack signaled for a halt. Ruby crouched beside him, rifle in hand, eyes sharp beneath her hood. Behind them, Iris set up a wireless relay, whispering updates into her headset. Marshall flanked left, peering through binoculars. This is bigger than Site 9, he muttered. More power, more security, more money. Jack nodded grimly. Then it's hiding something even uglier. He turned to Iris. You recording? She tapped her mic. Live feed started 60 seconds ago. If we disappear, the world sees everything. That was the deal. No more secrets. They approached the side of the compound, where a steel hatch lay buried in a slope. Ruby wired a remote charge low yield. Jack gave the nod. The blast was soft, just enough to snap the hinges. The hatch groaned open. They entered the hollow. Inside, the air changed. It was colder, heavier, like walking into the lungs of something that shouldn't be breathing. Dim red lights lined the ceiling. The walls were smooth concrete, sterile, and humming with buried generators. They moved through a long corridor, passing sealed doors marked with cryptic symbols, phase techs, compound, delta subject control. Jack scanned the markings, heart pounding. These weren't just storage labels, they were experiment logs. A flicker of movement caught his eye, surveillance cameras. Iris hacked the internal signal, streaming it back to her encrypted cloud server. They had only minutes before the system flagged them. They reached a circular chamber at the core. In the center stood a raised platform surrounded by transparent tanks. The liquid inside was faintly green, bubbling softly. And inside one of the tanks, Jack frozen. A human silhouette, floated tubes in its mouth, scars running like rivers across its pale skin. Jesus, Ruby whispered. There were more. 8 tanks, 8 test subjects. Cryostasis, biological suspension. It didn't matter. They were alive. Iris's voice cracked. These aren't remnants. This is active testing. Current. Funded. Marshall stepped forward, lifting a file from a nearby desk. It's all here. Genomic splicing, neurotoxins, behavioral control agents. This isn't just about defoliants or chemical waste anymore. Jack looked up at the monitors lining the wall. Live data feeds, lab notes, experiment logs labeled with today's date. The hollow wasn't history, it was the next phase. And it had never stopped. Someone is still running this, Jack muttered. A voice crackled through the intercom. You should have stayed buried, Mr. Mercer. Everyone spun toward the source. The voice was calm, measured, chillingly familiar. Jack stepped forward. Croft. A chuckle echoed through the speakers. You don't know how deep this goes. You think burning one site ends it. You think you've saved anyone. Jack's jaw tightened. I'm not here to save. I'm here to drag your secrets into the sun. Croft's voice turned cold. Then you've just signed your death warrant. All of you. Jack turned to Iris. Keep that stream live, no matter what. She nodded, fear in her eyes, but resolved in her voice. Already happening. Suddenly the facility lights flared white. Sirens blared. Heavy boots echoed through the hall's guards incoming. Jack grabbed a flash drive from the terminal. We split. 3 minutes. Extraction at the service tunnel. Ruby slapped a remote into his hand. I planted charges on the main server core. If we can't get out, no one gets what's in here. Marshall threw open a maintenance shaft. Go! They scattered. Jack ran through the corridor, the drive clutched in his hand, Iris on his heels. Gunfire erupted behind them. The halls shook as Ruby's charges detonated small ones' diversions. Jack's voice was steady even as the world unraveled around them. If this is the price for truth, then I'll pay it in full. They reached the tunnel exit. Jack shoved Iris through. A bullet grazed his shoulder, but he didn't stop. A bear appeared out of the trees, growling ready. Marshall fired a covering burst as they sprinted down the ravine. Smoke plumed behind them. The hollow roared like a wounded beast. Then came the final explosion of Ruby's charge on the data core. A blast lit the night sky. Trees swayed. The ridge cracked. Jack didn't look back. They had the drive. They had the footage. And now the hollow was in ashes. But Croft's voice still echoed in Jack's head. You don't know how deep this goes. Jack clenched his jaw, the firelight dancing in his eyes. No, not yet. But he would. Ash fell from the sky like slow-burning snow. Jack stood on the ridge, staring down at the smoldering remains of the hollow. Smoke curled from shattered earth. The once hidden facility was now a scar on the landscape, undeniable, irreversible, exposed. The sun was rising behind him, washing the horizon in bruised reds and purples. Bear sat at his side, silent and steady. He hadn't barked since the explosion. Just watched. Just wait. Below, emergency responders began to arrive, drawn not by whispers, but by truth broadcasted live. Drones hovered. Satellite trucks rumbled down logging roads. For once, the cameras weren't just chasing tragedy. They were capturing consequence. Iris joined Jack on the ridge, tablet in hand, eyes wide with disbelief. We're everywhere, she said softly. Networks are streaming the footage. Public records just confirmed Croft's name, the shell companies, and the funding. It's not speculation anymore. It's true. Jack didn't respond right away. He watched the fire chew through the last fragments of steel. How many years did this live underground? He said. How many people were told it was over, that it didn't matter anymore? Iris glanced at him. You made it matter. He shook his head. No. The people did. The ones who wouldn't shut up, who kept asking questions even when no one wanted answers. Behind them, Marshall radioed in. DC's calling it a security breach. But they're outnumbered. Every outlet's demanding a full congressional investigation. Jack turned away from the fire. Let them investigate, he said. Let them drag every piece of this machine into the light. They walked back toward the staging area where Ruby was being patched up by a field medic, her left arm in a sling. She looked up at Jack with a crooked grin. You look like hell. He offered her a bottle of water. Take one to no one. Marshall tossed a file onto the hood of their truck. Anonymous drop. Iris already verified it. Inside were names, dozens, some from Site 9, others tied to the Hollow. Politicians, contractors, medical officers, the people who signed off on things no country should ever allow. Jack flipped through the pages. With each name, the scope of it all grew heavier. They'll try to bury it again, Ruby said. Lawyers, settlements, smokescreens. Jack looked at the file. Then we bury them first, with truth, with every victim's name, every family that was lied to. We keep pushing until even silence starts to scream. The bear barked once, sharp and clear. Jack knelt, resting a hand on the dog's side. You carried me out, he whispered. Now we carry them. Across the site, volunteers from environmental watchdogs, veterans advocacy groups, and independent press started showing up. They weren't waiting for permission. They were documenting, preserving, bearing witness. Jack looked around at all of it and felt something strange. Hope. Not the naive kind. Not the kind that pretends darkness doesn't exist, but the kind that comes after fire. The kind born from ruin. Weeks later, in a packed auditorium at Columbia University, Iris took the stage to present the first Daniel Rowe Memorial Lecture. Jack sat in the front row beside Simon's daughter Claire, who held a faded photo of her father from his early days in uniform. Ruby wore her old fire tower jacket like armor. Bear sat by Jack's feet, quiet but alert. Iris adjusted the microphone. When I started as a journalist, she said I was told to keep things clean, stick to facts, avoid emotion. But stories like this, stories buried by fear, silence, and shame, aren't just data points. They're scars, and scars tell us we survived. She held up Rowe's journal. This story began with a man who disappeared because he refused to let the truth stay buried. It continued with a soldier who carried that truth on his back through fire, betrayal, and blood. And it lives on through every one of you here tonight. Applause rose like a wave. Jack didn't clap. He just listened. He needed to hear every word. Because for the first time in a long time, he believed they weren't fighting alone. Later that night, standing outside in the cold, Jack looked up at the stars. Bear pressed against his leg, warm and solid. Ruby walked over, offering him a cigarette. He declined. You think it's over? She asked. Jack shook his head. No, not even close. She lit hers. But you think we've got a chance now? He looked at her, really looked. Yeah, he said. Because we proved something. She raised an eyebrow. That the system can be broken, Jack said. But it can't erase people who refuse to disappear. He watched the wind move through the trees, the city lights flickering behind them. This isn't about revenge anymore, he added. It's about what kind of world we leave behind. He turned to Bear, ruffling his ears. A world where silence doesn't win. Ruby flicked her cigarette into the snow and stepped back. So what now? Jack smiled. We build something better. And we make damn sure no one ever has to dig this deep just to be heard. The sky above was wide open. And somewhere far away in the places still hidden, still hurting, someone else was listening. Someone who would know they were not alone. Not anymore.